Hello and welcome to New Wave History and Naya Daur PK. I'm truly delighted that Dr. Akbar Ahmed, who is a very well-known scholar of great merit, has given us time and is with us. Dr. Akbar S. Ahmed needs no introduction. He's a professor at the American University. He is a leading scholar when it comes to the plight and stories of Muslims across the globe, especially in the West. He's been a former diplomat, a senior civil servant in Pakistan, and a Renaissance man, if I may add, in all respects. And I wanted to start this series. I've been thinking and talking to Dr. Akbar Ahmed for years now that we need to do a detailed dive into both his scholarship, the areas of his interest, but the areas which have great resonance for the world and especially the Muslim communities all over the world. And this is why today we start with going back into history a few centuries ago into what is known as the golden age of Muslims or the golden age of Islam. There are different type of titles given to this particular period. And I will ask Dr. Akbar Ahmed about its origins, about what it means, about what can we learn from it for the present moment. So first of all, welcome, Dr. Saab. Thank you so much for your time. And maybe you can begin by telling me and the viewers, what do we mean by the golden age of Muslims when we use this term?
Raza, first of all, thank you for inviting me. As you know, I'm a big fan both of what you're doing and of you as a person, as a friend and colleague who I really admire and look up to. So thank you. I'm delighted to be on your show, having this discussion as two friends. This question of the golden age of Islam fascinates me not only as a historian and an anthropologist, but as a Muslim social scientist living in the first part of the 21st century. It's a crucial question. And the reason is that I have been looking for some kind of a theory to explain the spectacular rise of Islam. When Islam comes, the Prophet passes away in 632, and after that you see that Khalid bin Walid first takes on the Persian Empire and then the Roman Empire, and within a decade he's toppled two of the greatest empires on this planet. It's unthinkable what he's done. Brilliant, absolutely. He's considered one of the greatest generals in history. And then within a century, Islam is in Spain at one end of the continent of Europe, and in Sindh in South Asia at the other end. So Islam is now stretched across several continents. And then it generates these societies in Andalusia, Baghdad, and Bukhara. And I was very curious as to what was happening here, what was explaining these societies, what theories could we apply. We have, of course, historians like Ibn Khaldun and his cyclical theories that societies come from tribal areas, desert areas, settled. They come to the settled areas and cities, topple them, remove them, and in time, in 2 or 3 generations, they themselves become soft. They themselves become what he calls effete. And what keeps them together in the first place is the notion of asabiya, the communal feeling, the sense of community, which we call tribalism. Now, I wanted to go back to the golden age of Islam because it is a fascinating time of history. This is a time, and I want your viewers to just think about this. There's a time when Muslims like Sultan Salahuddin, one of the great rulers of history, and he's just defeated the Crusaders at Hattin. He's got back Jerusalem, and he's shown the humanity of a Muslim who conquers such a great, has such a great victory. He shows his behavior as a compassionate human being at that time, in the moment of victory. We have Al-Ghazali, one of the great thinkers at that time. I mean, these are all contemporaries. We have to the westernmost of at that time of the Muslim world, you have Ibn Rushd, a great name, an absolutely seminal figure. He's so great that an American philosopher said that it is Ibn Rushd who brings philosophy to the West, to modernity. Is that great? And people may not know, but there's a crater on the moon named after Ibn Rushd. That's the statue of this man. And above all, Razan, I want you to think about this, and I want your viewers to think about this. It's a time of great interfaith, intellectual to and froing of ideas. So Ibn Rushd's ideas, and perhaps his seminal central ideas where he absorbs the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, in his writing and advances them, enhances them. His idea that faith, religion, is compatible with progress and thinking and rationality, because the church had been grappling with this idea. The notion was, the method was to either have faith or have progress and science, which, by the way, still prevails today. Very often you'll hear this, especially in countries and societies like Pakistan, where people will say, oh, he's mazhabi hai and he's religious, and that the other person is scientific and therefore more progressive. Ibn Rushd established that that both are compatible. You can be one without having to give up the other. This was seminal because it resolved the issue of the church. And therefore, the greatest living intellectual in the Catholic Church then, St. Thomas Aquinas, he was made a saint, he was that great. St. Thomas Aquinas quotes Ibn Rushd over 500 times. Just think of this. Rushd is being quoted. He doesn't even call him by his name. He's so in awe of him that he calls him the commentator. This is the man who's going to explain the word. So Ibn Rushd over there. Then you had these great non-Muslims, giants, intellectual giants like Rabbi Maimonides, one of the great figures of Judaism, who wrote his classic, and the book on the dilemmas of the perplexed. It's a book, and it still is. It is a seminal book in thinking, especially for his own community, the Jewish community. But again, he's reflecting the ideas of Ibn Rushd. I've given the example of St. Thomas Aquinas. So there's a lot of toing and froing of ideas. And I'm just mentioning one or two names, but there's a whole list of names in this time.
No, this is fabulous. And really, we are talking, just for the viewers' context, we are talking about, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th centuries. And, often when people make fun of Muslims or Islamic cultures, they say, are you talking about the medieval ages? And it is important to know that when all of this Renaissance was going on, Europe was in the well-known dark ages, when this thinking, these ideas, rationality. So, Dr. Akbar Ahmed, I just want to elaborate a little bit on Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as is known in the Western chronicles. So you mentioned rationality and the blending of faith and progress. So can you shed a little more light on how he became the conduit for transporting the ideas from the Greeks to the Western scholarship? That's the other important role he played.
He absolutely played that role, Raza. And we must remember that it isn't Rushd alone. There are other great philosophers at that time. Remember, we are talking in terms of Rushd for Andalusia, but as I said, there are centers of learning in Baghdad, further to the east. There's a whole swathe of the planet which is bubbling with ideas, with inventiveness. And I am creating an ideal position. So, there's conflict and there's violence and so on in the midst of all this. But if you were to take a normative picture of society, this is what is happening. And you ask for some details. Well, Ibn Rushd spent his lifetime as a philosopher, and he spent his lifetime translating and adopting and absorbing the Greeks, not just Aristotle, also Plato, also Socrates. And the remarkable thing is, lessons for our rulers, for our leaders today, that he was patronized officially by the ruler. So the ruler would give him a small palace and resources so that he would spend all his time simply doing his work. Today, as you know, I've been in Pakistan, my friends and colleagues in Pakistan, like you, the intellectuals, the scholars. It's a battle just to survive, because, you're battling the daily grind just to be able to feed your family, and sometimes your pay is stopped and sometimes it isn't stopped, so you have to sifarish someone to get the file passed, so you have your monthly pay. Now imagine the Muslim world then has rulers who are sensible enough to say that I have to respect knowledge, I have to respect ilm, and this man or this woman is going to be left alone just to do his work, and they'll produce something. That's why Ibn Rushd, and again, he's not the only one, were able to produce this very rich, I would say, corpus of learning. Now, I want to make a point here. This period, roughly between the 8th, 9th century, which goes up to the 13th, 14th century, a lot is happening here. The Crusades are hitting the Muslim world from the west. From the east come the Mongols. They're hitting the Muslim world. And therefore, it's a very, very turbulent phase of history. And that's why I take heart, Raza, as a Muslim scholar looking at history. We are going through a turbulent world today. And, you know, when I look at what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening with the Rohingya and Kashmir and so on, there's a great turbulence, and the ordinary Muslim is facing very many serious challenges. And I think to myself that in some ways, Rumi or Ibn Arabi and these great philosophers that we are discussing in the Golden Age also were going through this very turbulent phase where they imagine the Muslim world is being assaulted by the Crusaders in the West. And these are major assaults, hundreds of thousands of warriors coming and killing and looting and so on. And then from the East, the Mongols who come and destroy Baghdad. They not only ransack all the libraries, they destroy the irrigation systems of the Abbasids, which are very complicated and very intricate irrigation systems. So that destroys the economy. So we are talking, and yet in the midst of this, these extraordinary scholars are carrying on their work, carrying on with their imagination. I'll give you two examples which should really astound you. Raza, one is Abbas ibn Firnas. Now you've heard the name. Yes. He is the first man who attempted flight. And I want you to keep this in mind. He's an astronomer, he's a mathematician, he's a philosopher, he's a poet, and he wants to experiment flight. So he actually climbs up onto a hill in Cordoba, puts some feathers and some wooden boards on himself, and he jumps off a high, small mountain peak. And it is said, these are stories from the past, that he was in mid-flight for about 10 minutes. He actually flew. So he's the first man to experiment with flight, not Leonardo da Vinci or the Wright brothers in the United States. So we had a Muslim philosopher attempting flight. Now, he is one of what you could call the Renaissance men. These are people who are philosophers, writers, scholars, astronomers, but also poets, also people who could appreciate life. And that is what was very great about this period of the Golden Age, where Muslims are producing this kind of man and woman who in turn would be known in the West as the Renaissance man when this movement came to Italy. And then, of course, you had the Enlightenment, and then you had the discovery of America and the progress of the American nation, the American state, and you had all the scientific discoveries and the takeoff. And that is where we sort of leave the modern world. So to go back to the Golden Age, on the one hand, you had Ibn Firnas, and then again, a contemporary of Salahuddin. You have named some great figures at that time. Another man is Umar Khayyam. So when people hear of Umar Khayyam, people say, oh, he's a poet and he was writing about Sharab and Ayashi and all. He wasn't. Again, he was a Sufi figure, a great mathematician. He literally gave some very original concept about the planet, about astronomy, about mathematics, algorithms, algebra. He was dealing with these very scientific as a philosopher. And then on top of all that, we have this incredible, this beautiful quatrains that he's, he wrote them not exactly as they are being translated into English, but it's Fitzgerald, who in the 19th century, an Englishman, who translates them into his English. And they immediately, the first year, not a single copy is sold of Omar Khayyam's translations. And then they become the most popular book in the British Empire, very, very widely quoted. Who hasn't heard of this quote? Who hasn't heard of this, Raza? The quote that says, "The moving finger writes, and having written, moves on. Nor all their piety nor wit shall lure back to cancel half a line. Nor all thy tears wash a word of it." Very profound, and in a sense, very sad, but that is what life is. And then you had another aspect of this period, the Golden Age, women playing an absolutely front-line role in society. The teacher of Ibn Arabi was a woman. The woman who founded Fez, the oldest university in the world, which is still functioning, was a woman. We know of Rabi, great Sufi saint, woman. So women were contributing to society in very rich ways. That's another feature. So you had this interfaith, you had the role of women, you had the respect for scholars. And again, I was looking for a theory. Why was this happening? My answer, Raza, is this, and this is my theory, that Muslim societies were suffused, were permeated with what I call the ilm ethos. Now, what is the ilm ethos? The ilm ethos is the resting of society on three central Islamic features. The feature of ilm, respect, high respect for ilm, which is knowledge. Quranic.
Yeah.
Knowledge, that's knowledge. It's in the Quran. Ilm is the second most used word in the Quran after the word for God. Again and again, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, is saying, the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. There are many, many quotations like this. So remarkably, the Prophet is telling men and women, this is the remarkable thing, go and seek knowledge. This is the greatest thing you can have. And this is a paradox of our societies. When I look at the Muslim world, I look up the figures that Muslims are spending on education. And in spite of Muslims being very keen to educate their children, I find the government spend very little money on education or maintaining great schools or promoting scholarship. And I find that that's a great tragedy. So one of the reasons that the Golden Age became the Golden Age and created this very rich environment for scholarship is the respect for ilm. Number two, adl, justice. No society can function without justice. Now I ask you as a leading Pakistani, can you really say that the courts of Pakistan, the judges of Pakistan are giving justice to the people of Pakistan? Now, like you, I've been in the field, I've been a magistrate, and I know how frustrated people are when they don't get justice. Justice is delayed, which, as you know, when justice is delayed, justice is denied. And Pakistanis are very frustrated because they really feel that justice is not available. And then the third pillar was ihsan or compassion, balance. Again, that is missing. Without that compassion, and all 3 points go back to the leader. The leader in Muslim societies has to be a man or woman of great ideals, of great character, because they reflect the society and they provide these 3 features. Now, you may say, where do you have this in real life? Of course, the example of our own Holy Prophet is the greatest example, but you have many, many people like Hazrat Ali's famous book that he's left behind. It's a remarkable book full of wisdom, full of very poetic and very idealistic ideas for people. And again, people I don't think read it so much as something to instruct them. They see it only as a religious book. Then you have in the Muslim world, Amir Abdul Rahman, the first ruler of Cordoba. Now again, think of this example. And I challenge you, Raza, to give me an example from the modern Muslim world, modern Muslim leaders. This man is transported from Damascus, where he's escaped as a young prince. He escapes with his life because the rest of his family are killed by the Abbasids, who've done a coup against the Umayyads. Only Abdul Rahman escapes, and after a very, very adventurous escape through North Africa, crossing from Africa into Andalusia, he arrives and ends up as the Amir, the ruler of Cordoba. And he still has that love for Damascus in his heart. So he makes the most beautiful grand mosque in Cordoba. And I've had the pleasure of visiting several times. That's where Allama Iqbal went and said a prayer in the Mihrab and wrote a beautiful poem on Cordoba, Masjid Cordoba. And he is so moved, Amir Abdul Rahman. This is the question I'm asking. Give me a counter example from the Muslim world today. He writes a poem a poem to the date tree. He looks out and he sees a date palm, a khajur tree, and he writes a poem. He says, like you, I'm a stranger in a strange land. Like you, I am displaced.
Right, right. That is so
just
beautiful. Yes.
And then Raza, he's nostalgic. So he creates this mosque with 1,000 pillars within the mosque. And just outside in the garden, and even now you can see it, 1,000 date palms. So date palms in the mosque, so the person who's saying his prayer sitting there. Even now when you go in, you get the sense of these pillars which are like date palms. You're sitting there and you step outside and see all the actual date palms. It's a concept that he creates. More important, he embodies learning, so that Cordoba becomes a city with 93 libraries. The biggest library has 600,000 books, when the largest library in Europe had 600. Just think of these comparisons. 600,000. This Cordoba, when Cordoba was then considered the largest, most resplendent city in Europe. Remember, there's no London, there's no Paris at that time. They grow later. This is when Cordoba is shining on the subcontinent. But it's the character of Abdur Rahman. And he establishes a society where there's respect for ilm, adl, and ihsan. And many acts of his in which and then his descendants, they pick this up. So his son and his grandson, Abdur Rahman III, who takes Cordoba and Andalusia to different heights. Abdur Rahman III's chief minister, chief advisor is Jewish. His ambassador is a Catholic priest. So it's an environment and a society they're creating which leaves the rest of Europe stunned. It's very rich. You have scholars being respected. Scholars are so adventurous in their thinking. Haytham discovers the camera obscura, which eventually becomes the cinema, the camera through which we make films. You have scholars and physicians discovering parts of the human anatomy and experimenting with it. Their books are then read for the next 500, 400 years. Literally, Europe learns and applies the knowledge from these books. So when you look at the Golden Age, it isn't just a simple Golden Age, it's a very rich Golden Age. And the paradox is, I've been to museums, I went to the London Museum, and I looked at the panels they have for history, and this is how the panel reads. History starts with the Greeks, then goes on to the Romans, then there's 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, and then it goes on to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and modernity, and we are into our period of history. And I said, what happened to the Muslims for 1,000 years? What happened to Ibn Rushd and all these incredible Ibn Firnas and Umar Khayyam and all these great characters? They've disappeared. So, Raza, I really feel, number one, that we have to, Muslims especially, and people studying Muslim societies, have to answer the question, what was the cause of the spectacular rise of the Muslims and then the spectacular decline of the Muslims? Both of these questions are linked to the idea of what was happening within society. And if you have the ilm ethos, that society is resilient and is strong. And above all, then you do not have the excuse which we do now of blaming others. I talk to so many Muslim intellectuals and they'll invariably say, what's wrong with, say, the problems in Pakistan? They'll say, sab wo Indians karwa rahe hain, Afghan karwa rahe hain, ya bahar wale karwa hain, Middle East, they'll say Israel karwa raha hai. So you are not relying on others to explain your actions. The ilm ethos forces you to rely on yourself, on your own character, your own integrity, and your own.
Yes.
And the Muslim mind, I'm repeating this, Raza, that the Muslim mind, Ibn Firnas has a crater on the moon named after him. Ibn Rushd has a crater on the moon. These are giants. Why don't we even know about these giants who should then be able to inspire us? This is my lesson for our rulers and our leaders, that they are sitting almost in a historical cocoon, a historical isolated cell, and they have to connect with their own past, because without understanding their past, they're not going to be able to understand what path or what route to take for the future.
Yes, Dr. Saab, that's really a fascinating you've summarized so many centuries and very beautifully in so few words. And I think what I'm gathering from what you just said is the ilm, or the knowledge ethos, the learning, the knowledge, the spirit of inquiry, intellectual engagement, scientific research and discovery. I think that has been, was the central theme of this particular age, which Muslims have completely ignored. I think the other thing that I picked was that how women in this particular time, whether they were Sufis or whether they were, scholars, or whether they were founders of universities or learning centers, had a very important role. And that is, again, we see later in the later centuries, that how women's role was also marginalized and almost erased from this. Though just the way the West has erased the Muslim histories, we have also erased these important women. This world's first university founded by a woman is a story not really repeated quite often in the Muslim world, let alone other parts of the world. But I do want to, before you go on to the spectacular decline, as you eloquently put it, I just want to also ask you, how much of a role did colonialism play in caricaturing, in orientalizing of these Muslim figures and histories, because Umar Khayyam, when I was growing up, was this great romantic poet with a glass of wine and a beautiful woman on the miniatures of that time. And later on, I realized, as you said, that he was a mathematician, he was a philosopher, he was a serious thinker, not just a drunk poet. Good poet, of course, but he's been mythologized as this kind of dreamy drunkard. But anyway, I would like to add you to elaborate this bit on the role of colonial.
Raza, I feel, and in my book Discovering Islam, I had gone into this in some detail. I feel that Muslim societies, with all the impact, the devastating impact of colonization, still manage to survive because of the strength of the structure within Muslim society. But over time, that structure began to melt and shake, so that the structures of leadership, the family, the role of women and men, the role of education, these began, and it was very difficult for them to hold on to. I knew from the example of my parents and that generation who were still straight out of the colonial era. The British were still ruling India when Pakistan was made. And I just wondered the devastation that came with colonization. Now, a good period to look at is 1857. When 1857 happened and destroyed the Muslim elite of India. Remember, the Muslims have been ruling for 600-700 years. The decline had begun. The Mughal emperor was really restricted to the Red Fort and little more than that. But it was still there. There were still players in the game. But after 1857, the full impact was felt by Muslim societies, because the British argued, the colonialism, that this is the community that are troublemakers and we have to control them one way or the other. So one action was, and this is again, you can check this, historians will confirm this, that virtually any young man, any man who's 14 or 15 years old, from Delhi to Rawalpindi to the north, was literally picked up and they would hang him up. So any young man was fair game. The princes, the sons and grandsons of Bahadur Shah Zafar were brought before him, and Major Hodgson shot them one by one, so that the entire generation was wiped out in front of him, right? In front of this old man. He was by then 82 years old. So this is the physical representation of Muslim men. Then the culture. We don't fully appreciate that Persian was the language of India. India, Muslims, Hindus, everyone Hindu spoke it. It was the language of the office. And when the East India Company came, they learned Persian. Many of them became great scholars in Persian. This was the language. And then Lord Macaulay, as you know, simply wiped it out. He said, that's it. No more Persian. We'll switch to English. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it was important that we in South Asia had access to a modern language like English. It brought many benefits, and there's a debate about that, but not at the cost of your own base, your cultural base, because that meant that your entire thinking had to be realigned and restructured. And I think the process has not still completely, we haven't recovered from that. I hear the debate even in Pakistan, so that people will be saying that these great languages of Pakistan, Punjabi, Pashto, Balochi, these are great, Sindhi, these are great languages of the land. And they suffered as a consequence also. They were just thrown out. So these are, I think, some of the negative. And then above all, I think, Raza, that we developed a sense of inferiority, ehsaas-e kamtari, so that you have people feeling that only the West has something worthwhile to teach us. Our own culture, our own history is worthless, and we have to move on. And again, sitting here in Washington, and I look at the world and I look at developments, I look and compare, as most Pakistanis do, India and Pakistan, and I'm just amazed and impressed by what Indians have done. The new Vice President Vance, who's been nominated by President Trump for the forthcoming elections, his wife is Indian. The President, Vice President has an Indian background. Rishi Sunak was Indian. There's so many Indians and doing so well. Media, television, physicians, the CEOs of so many companies, I don't even have to make a reference there. And why is this? Why is this happening? You know, Pakistanis are constantly asking this question. The answer is simple, that after partition, Nehru, the first Prime Minister, and credit is due to him, he created these institutes of excellence, which then in turn created a generation, two generations of people who went on and really contributed to the world and are now reaping the benefits. And I know, because I've gone through the system, you know, Raza, you've gone through the system, every effort was a struggle. Just to even say, I want to do a degree or I want to write a book, it became it was a struggle. So I'm making that comparison because this question is asked by my younger generation. I have young students like you who will ask you, both of you started in 1947. How come the Indians have gone so far ahead? And when you talk of the golden age, you are proving that Muslims were capable of being at the cutting edge of science and mathematics and physics and astronomy. So what happened? The answer is clearly that ilm and this section of ilm, we fell back. Section of adl, we fell back. We didn't give it that serious attention we should have given. And ihsan itself, the compassion, where we seem to have lost the compassion. You see the cruelty today. I hear these terrible stories of people being cruel, the police barging into people's houses, insulting women, pulling them by their hair. This is not decent behavior. This is not human behavior. This is certainly not Islamic behavior. So these are, I think, questions rather which history helps us. It throws this behavior in relief. I'm not saying simply as a criticism. I'm saying that we have to look at ourselves critically.
I think this is a really important contemporary parallels you are drawing. So, Dr. Saab, I would take you back to the 14th and 15th centuries, you know, when this decline was taking effect. Of course, you mentioned the Mongols coming and attacking the Muslim empire. You talked about other factors, and there were internal fissures as well. Also, the lifestyle of the ruling elites, right? And their distancing from perhaps knowledge or ilm, or you know, as you mentioned. So, just tell us how did this then golden age eclipse and turn into what happened after that? You know, when it waned.
Raza, very briefly, the Mongols finished the Arabs forever. After the Abbasids, they were destroyed. Baghdad is destroyed. You will note that the Arabs, as it were, leave history. There will be other empires, great empires, but none of them will be Arab. So the Ottomans emerge. Then you have the Safavid in Iran, and you have the Mughals in India. These are great empires. And in their time, they had great architecture, great scholarship, great achievements. But they themselves began to lose vitality by the 18th century. And there's a lot going on in the 18th century. While these are unwieldy, as you said, the elite is corrupt. They are locking themselves in their palaces. They have many wives, many women, sharab, ayashi. At the same time, well away from the ilm ethos, they've moved away from it. At the same time, and this is devastating, you have the emergence of European powers. And European powers are now emphasizing precisely what we lost: ilm, education, justice, and compassion to their fellow man. These are virtues coming out of the West. If you read the Constitution and the Declaration of America, it sounds almost like it was Islamic in the sense that it emphasizes precisely these virtues, or that of the Enlightenment. So one civilization was losing this, another civilization was gaining it. And then, of course, the fact that they colonized Muslim societies was the final straw, and they then really very systematically dismantled some of the key features of Muslim societies. Now, whether we recover them, or whether we find a new path, or whether we are even able to recognize how much we lost. One of the great challenges to historians is to work out how much we lost, the ledger, what was lost and what remained. And I know we haven't even started that exercise yet. So these are the challenges, Raza, that intellectuals like you have to think about and raise for the coming time, because we are at this moment very much transfixed by what is happening here and now, because politics in the Muslim world is all about now, which means, who's in power, who's out of power, who's doing what to whom. And we have to sit back and think of the long term, and that can only be satisfactorily viewed if you view it in the lens of the past.
Yes, so that is absolutely correct. I mean, thinking about this, but before we end this really amazing conversation, I can go on and on, but I don't want to make you sit here for ages in front of your computer. But I think you, right at the start, you talked about interfaith harmony and how different religious identities, different denominations coexisted in this period of 3 to 4 centuries, that is loosely packaged as the golden age of Islam. So also tell us that, because we also see a lot of myopia later. When the decline started, we also saw the rise in sectarian tensions, in the treatment of non-Muslims, perhaps, as we see in the current Muslim majority countries. So let's talk a bit about that, the role of Jewish people, the role of rabbis, whom you write a lot about in your books.
Yes, because Raza, again, if you are confident in who you are, if you know that you are reflecting a larger civilization, you have the confidence to deal with others. And this, by the way, it doesn't only apply to Muslims. Other non-Muslims are the same, and these rules and principles apply to them. But when Muslims were at their height during the Golden Age, you saw their attitude. So some Muslims had prejudice against the Sunnis or Shias. You had that sectarian divide. You had the regional divide. You belonged to one empire or another. But by and large, as I said, normatively, you had a very healthy relationship between the different faiths. And Maimonides is an example. He's expelled from Cordoba. There are various reasons for that. Ibn Rushd is expelled from Cordoba, who's a Muslim philosopher. So the dynasties changed. Stricter, more fundamentalist groups have come from North Africa. And as a result, these two great philosophers are chased out. Where does Maimonides land up? As you know, Raza, he lands up as the physician to Sultan Salahuddin, the greatest ruler of that time, of the Middle East. Now just think of this example of the greatest rabbi of his time as the physician to the greatest Muslim ruler. So he has access to Salahuddin at any time, and he can give anything in terms of the medicine and the potions he's giving him. But there's complete trust there. So it's a different relationship. And if you want to understand that period of history, you read Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta travels through the Middle East, he travels to Africa, he comes to India, and he writes. So all that is written and we have access. So it's like a view from a documentary of that time. And you have a very coherent world, very coherent world. The plague hits Damascus, and he describes a journey from Damascus down to Gaza to Cairo, where rabbis, priests, and imams, the three faiths, are walking with their holy books and praying to God, praying that this scourge, the plague, is removed. And I was thinking how ironic It was heartbreaking that you see what's happening in the Middle East right now, and yet you had these three faiths treating each other as humans and with mutual respect and understanding that when a plague-like affliction hits humanity, everyone is a victim. And you have to really unite to face these challenges that humanity faces.
Right, exactly. I think this is really so many lessons for today, as you rightly say. And I think this is a great start to our series, Dr. Akbar Ahmed. You know, I really hope we can continue and finish step by step and go through these different periods of history, right to the present day and to different parts of the world, and look and unpack all that you've been researching about, writing for these decades, because I think what we aim to do through this video format is to distill that knowledge, those insights, those anecdotes, those characters and figures that you talked about, so that our younger generations know about that and are inspired to read about them, to research. And with that, I would thank you and hope to have you again. And we will follow up this episode with another interesting, deep examination of our past. And until then, stay tuned. Thank you, Dr. Akbar Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Raza. Thank you. And I hope our younger generation will also have a sense of pride in the golden age of Islam.